All right, hello students. Welcome to another video today with me, Professor Wright. Today we're going over part two of chapter two of Living with Art by Mark Getlein. This is the chapter over what is art, what defines art. We were kind of in the middle of talking about that. Yeah, sort of in the middle. And I'm gonna just jump to, let's see. Yes, jump to the slides here. Let me make sure that they were visible. And yes, we just finished talking about, observer. We had already talked about audience. We talked about what gives art value. Uh, and we finished up by talking about art and what makes you informed observer, study and understanding context, which we'll get to in a minute, and understanding just studying art, getting better as an observer in order to enrich your experience. But we also learned about beauty and how, there's the highly skillful beauty that's like perfect and balanced and nice to look at, and we know that that's beauty versus, more complex beauty that's not necessarily easy to look at. Even if it is easy to look at, it's not about it being skilled. And then other times, even if it's beautiful to look at, but the story is more moving or sad or angering or whatever, there's just more complexity to what makes beauty beauty. So talking about that, building off of that, as we start part two, let's talk about art and appearance. So ever since, like I said, as well, as long as there's been art, there's been style. But style has really become an important part of art ever since the creation of the camera, like we talked about in part one. Ever since that the real world could be captured by a machine, artists, the way that they separate themselves, as artists, as creatives, is to come up with a new way of looking at things. And this is called style. So style refers to a characteristic or group of characteristics that we recognize as constant, recurring, or coherent in artwork, in an artist's work, or in a group of artists' work. So things that kind of count as style are characteristic subject matter, so making art about the same thing. Characteristic use of material, using the same material in a unique, same unique material consistently throughout, again, either an artist's work or a series, a group of artists' work. A distinct way of drawing or applying the paint, so impressionists like thick, heavy paint versus like smooth glazes of oil paint, done in layers and layers, done like in the Renaissance, right? Those ways of distinctively putting down the material are a style. Color preferences or color combinations, so using only a certain color palette, or specifically limiting your color palette, right? Even if they're different between each piece, saying I'm only going to use two colors, right? That becomes a style in and of itself. But also using only red, yellow, blue, right? Those things are style. And then of course there's always like cultural style, like a cultural, like a place, or a group of people, a culture. There's a historical style, so like a style based on when the piece is being made, if it's made in the Gothic era or the Romanesque era, or there's even schools of style. So even if they're done at the same time or a long time apart, if there's an impressionist way of working, if an artist now is an impressionist versus an impressionist of the late 1800s, they're going to be working in the same sort of school, right? So that style remains consistent. Neoclassical, anytime you see neo, by the way, it just basically means new, right? So it's usually a copying of a past style or a new way of looking at an old style. Same for proto, just means original style, like pre-style. In any case, we can generally find what group an artist belongs to, what culture they might belong to, what place they might be from, or what time they might be from, strictly by looking at their painting, or we at least can at least get an idea. And that's actually a really important thing for me to communicate to you guys as students in this art appreciation course, right? I'm not big on making you memorize certain art pieces by certain artists, but I would like you to be able to look in an artwork and say, you know what, I think that's probably a Bierstadt, but either way, it's one of the Hudson River School, and he's an American romanticist, right? You might, or something like that. It's romanticism. It's done in the 1800s, right? Or you could say, well, this is definitely all 20th century art because of the way that the paint is applied. I can just tell that. I would like you to be able to do that at the end of this class. If you can't, I understand. I mean, but that for me is a goal, that you would look at this and know that it's very painterly, but then the like kind of grayness of it means it's like really pretty new. some of this stuff. I don't know, looking at the next slide, you would be able to look at this and know that's probably from like the late 20th century when photorealism became big again, like coming back to drawing things really realistic after the camera had taken that away for a while. Artists began to do that more. Or this one, which you're like, okay, well, I know because there's like a certain flatness or like weirdness to this, that was painted before the camera. You could say that, I'm happy. Look at this and say, well, that's Cubist, that's early 20th century, stuff like that. And this is helped along by looking at the style, right? We can look at the style of an art piece, the way like this piece is so soft, and for whatever reason, it's like floating and it's like very real, but almost too real to where it doesn't even look that real anymore. That's either neoclassicism or mannerism, right? And I know the answer, but hopefully at the end of this class, you would have come up with that too. This is expressionist, right? The way that these, actually all of these would be in some way expressionist. And you just know that because of the way that, these characters are sort of flattened and outlined, or this one, it's sort of elongated and changed, and the perspectives are weird. And like, of course, this one's like pretty grotesque. So it's got to be from like, I don't know, the 1940s, right? Late expressionist, Abex, right? I don't know. I would like for you to be able to do this, and do this by tying together things like what I'm talking about: the glaziness, the floatiness, the outlining, the flat color, the unfinished color of fields, the abstraction, right? Those things. I would like you to see that. In any case, in order to get to that, you're going to need most of the semester, right? We're going to talk all about those things: outlining, flatness, form, glazing, the material used, how painterliness, right? We're going to talk about all that. But first, let's start simple. So talking about art and appearance, looking at what the artist is actually displaying in what way. Okay, so there's 3 different ways that we talk about the way that the artist is showing the image, right? Okay, in terms of the direct appearance of the art. Okay, and this, when we talk about this, we're talking about representational, abstract, and non-objective. Okay, and these are actually something that I would really love for you, like top 5, especially abstract and non-objective. I would love for you to know these, like top 5 things Mr. Wright would love for you to know is in terms of art and appearances: representational, non-objective, and abstract. Now, these relate to how the artist shows the world. So first off, representational means it is something from the world that we are supposed to recognize it. We see it and we know exactly what we're looking at. And typically, if it's representational, the artist often wants it to look as realistic as possible. This is known as naturalistic. This is very important. This might even be a quiz question that you need to know, that we don't really like to call something that looks real realism, because realism is its own art history movement that has to do with painting regular people. When something looks realistic, we call it naturalistic. Now, I switch up the terms all the time, but you should know on a technical level, the vocabulary term for painting things that look really real is naturalistic, not realistic, naturalistic. Okay. Hopefully you catch that, because a lot of people miss that question later. In any case, it is meant to be often as naturalistic as possible when something is painted as representational. But just remember, representational means it represents the world, right? It looks like the world around us. We see it and we know what it is. And then again, as naturalistic as possible. Sometimes it's not really super real looking, but we try our best, right? That's what representational means. Now, looking at this art piece, I'm not going to tell you who the artist is, but we know, we can look at this and we see exactly what's happening. We see the dress, we see the tablecloth, we see the candles and the lighting, we see the facial hair on the man. It all looks very much like it's from the real world, and so it is representing that real world. It is representational. Now, the next step is abstract art. This is actually kind of a little pet peeve of mine. It's not really super pet peeve, but a little bit, that a lot of people look at a painting of like splatters or like flat squares and stuff, and they call it abstract. It's not really that simple. Abstract art is actually what I always like to say, it is not the splatters and dots. It actually is something different. Abstract art is art that starts with something from the real world, and usually we recognize it in some way. So just squares and dots, those don't look like anything from the real world, so they don't belong in abstract. Usually, though, what happens with abstract art is that it takes a scene from real life and it simplifies it, exaggerates it, or alters it in some way. It alters real life subject matter. You can think of it as stylized, right? It's an artist saying his style by depicting this thing from the real world in his style, right? It's altered. We know it's from the real world, but it's altered a little bit. It is abstracted. That's what that word means. It's just changed. It's altered. It's a distinctive set of characteristics or parameters. Usually, that's what makes it a style. It's usually connected to the artist's culture, the artist's movement. Cartoons and anime belong to this. It's the same idea, like Homer Simpson. We know he's a person, but he doesn't look like any real person I've ever met. He's abstracted, right? Or looking at this piece here, I don't think anybody in this room or anybody watching this would be surprised to say if I said that this piece is called Girl with Mandolin, right? Because you look at this and you see a person, you see a mandolin, right? You see the things happening. However, if I ask you, does this look like a real person? Of course, you would say no. It's geometrically changed. It's abstracted. She doesn't even have a face, right? She doesn't even have like a left shoulder. The lute is all, it would never play anything. It's all like truncated and weird, right? It's altered. It's changed. It's abstracted. Okay. This is a very specific thing. That's abstract. Now, real quick, I want you to know that the painter who painted this also painted this, right? I love this little set of slides because I get to blow your mind. He painted this when he was 15. By the time of the peak of his art career, he was painting this, which is called the Cubist style. Yes, because this is Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso could paint very naturalistically. He was very well studied. He was a prodigy, but he made the decision to abstract things as a part of his art career. That's why he became so ingenious, right? He was changing the way that we looked at it, showing us his way of looking at it, right? So Girl with a Mandolin, Pablo Picasso, abstract. However, now let's talk about non-representational or non-objective. They mean the same things. This is the splatters and dots. It is non-representational because it does not represent anything from real life. I like to say that non-representational art relates to nothing outside of itself. It's just its thing. It's triangles and squares and rectangles for the sake of triangles, rectangles, and squares. It's paint splatters, it's dots, it's flat. It doesn't look like anything that I could go walk around in real life. It's purely formal is another way of looking at it. Line, shape, space, color, those are the elements of art. So basically, when we look at that chapter, you can think of an art piece that is made just with elements of art. That's non-representational, right? There is no story. There's no narrative, right? Narrative just means story. There is usually not even a statement, right? It's just an experience. They just want you to see the colors. They want you to see the shapes. They want you to see the way they did it. That's all they want you to see. It is not representing something, okay? So just remember, splatters and dots, abstract is not splatters and dots, okay? Now, going on from there, two other things that we should think about as we break down what a piece of art is art and meaning. So the form versus the content. Okay, so first off, form is the form of an art piece is the physical appearance of the artwork. Is it two-dimensional, three-dimensional? What color is it? What are the shapes? Are there people? How many? Are there animals? How many? Where are they all at in the image, right? This is all the form. It's this, looking at Rodin's The Thinker, it's a bronze sculpture. It's a sculpture, so it's 3D. It's not painted, so it's just the color of the bronze is some kind of patina. And then it's a man, he's sitting, he's thinking, right? That's the physical form of the artwork. Now, the content is the meaning. Now, do not get content mixed up with context. Also, don't get content mixed up with narrative. Narrative is a story. Content does not necessarily always have to be a story. Okay, the content of an artwork is the story or the meaning. What's actually happening and where and why. It is depicted. What is depicted is also sometimes known as the subject matter. So like the content of a splatter painting, there's no story there. It's not a narrative, right? But the meaning of it, the content, is the subject matter of elements in art, right? I know that's a little tricky, a bunch of layers to that word, but the subject matter is just basically another word for content, but it's the word we use when content doesn't have a story. The word we use for content that is a story is narrative. Okay, let me let that sink in. Narrative, story, subject matter is just content that's just some meaning, some communication, propaganda, social stratification, elements and principles, whatever. They're not a story, they're the content, right? But it's all about basically just remember the content is meaning narrative is story. They're different. Okay. Now looking at this piece here, the content of this piece, if you knew the names of these people and knew what was happening and all that, that would be the narrative, which is a form of content. But for the most part, we don't know all that stuff. So the content of this piece is just a bunch of people sitting around having lunch. That's the subject matter. Human beings at leisure is the subject matter. The content is the story. I know it's probably extra confusing, but just basically think about anything that fits into the meaning of the artwork instead of the physical appearance of the artwork. That's the content. The story here, people having lunch, right? And then I guess you could get into the drama of who's who and who's looking at who and who's thinking about what, right? That's all part of content or meaning, okay? Now, just to get into more content that is not the same as a narrative, sometimes what it is made of is the content. So the form of the art piece, what it's made of, sometimes is telling you the content. Okay, so looking at this piece, one of my favorites, favorite artists, Janine Antoni, she's got this block of chocolate and she's got this block of lard, right? Those are the materials. She takes a bite off each day and eventually gets enough chocolate or lard to form. First off, with the chocolate, she forms these heart-shaped sort of chocolate box, empty chocolate box shapes, right? So it's chocolate used to shape a chocolate box that is empty of chocolates, right? That's meaningful. But then she also shapes the lard into these pieces of lipstick, right? How you connect these things, that is the content. So the form is chocolate, but the content is also chocolate. So we look at, you can dig into what is the content. I usually ask the class here, and you get into like, well, she used chocolate to make the tin, but then the fact that the tin is, or it's not a tin, whatever it is, the little box that holds the chocolates, it's empty, right? So the person who's there ate it all. And there's something inherently sad about looking at a box of chocolates that then is empty, right? And then to also look at it next to lipstick, which is something we use to cover up or distract from our flaws, but then it's made out of lard, which sometimes, you know, is considered, you know, I don't know, physical beauty standards are a part of the content here, right? Something that normally would, you know, even just talking about that it's a piece of lard, we think of that as like kind of gross, but then that's what lipstick is, right? And it's used to cover up things. I don't know. But then the inherent like sadness too, again, of an empty box of chocolates right next to the superficiality of lipstick, right? It's all a very complex thing, but you couldn't have the layers of that meaning if you didn't understand the form as it's being made into content. So the form alone, actually, and there is no story at all. It's literally just that what it's made of is telling you the story, right? I guess the thing that it is, like the lipstick or chocolate box, those are a story in and of themselves. But yeah, that's content. But this is where content and form overlap. Form is chocolate. The story of these things is content. Okay. Another good example of form and content overlapping a little bit. Mark Quinn, you know, he did this series of sculptures where he took some of his blood and he drew blood, and then he made a mold of himself, and then he had the blood cast into the shape of himself. That's inherently kind of gross. I saw these in person. They are kind of gross, but then it's like, well, why is that gross? He's made of the blood that he used to then make the copies of himself, right? The form of this is that it's a sculpture of him made of blood, but then the content is it's about him, right? And then the blood makes him and all that stuff. Then we get into Siren. This other piece here is a mold he made of, or a sculpture he made of Kate Moss, but made of gold, right? So that's about the commodification of like models and supermodels, right? That they're like commodities, they're money, they're not people, right? In a way, right? They're a thing, right? So that's form, and then the content is what the form is made out of. All that layers. But just remember, at the end of the day, form is the physical appearance of the thing. Content is the meaning of the thing. Okay? Moving on from that, now context, not the same as content, although context just change content. Context describes the personal, social, cultural, and historical setting for a piece of art and the place in which it is created, received, and interpreted, the time and place, and for whom it was made. Okay, so it's the whole surrounding time and details of an art piece, right? Again, it will change the content, but it is not the same as content. Context is time and place. So we look at this art piece here, another Pablo Picasso. this very abstracted art piece of these animals sort of running. The people are screaming and moving. There's fire, what appears to be some sort of explosion or light, right? There's broken weaponry. There's the severed limbs, right? There's just something disturbing happening, but at the end of the day, it's just this weird, dramatic scene, right? And Guernica, I don't know, some of you may know the context, but I'm about to give it to you, because when we just look at this, I'm letting you absorb it as just a painting of things. But now let's dig into the context, right? So the context of Guernica is that this is a painting that Pablo did. I believe he was in France during the years, I think it was in the years just prior to World War II. Yeah, it was the late 30s. There was a little town called Guernica in Spain, which is where Pablo Picasso's from. Although he's not in Spain, because Spain at this time is being taken over by a fascist dictatorship under Francisco Franco. Now, Francisco Franco was not allied with the Nazis and the fascists of Italy. He was running his own thing. He was kind of like, it's cool, Axis powers, y'all do your thing, but let me do mine. They're separate. However, Franco was also not on the side of the Allies. But in any case, Picasso leaves because fascist dictatorships are not a great place to be an artist, especially an artist who's critical of powers. Okay. But in any case, Picasso's out of town, and while that's sort of irrelevant, but in any case, in terms of the occurrence, this little town of Guernica kind of opposed Francisco in a lot of ways politically, and they didn't really give in to his reign. And so this is in the north of Spain. The Nazis, who again, they're kind of okay with the Spanish, but they're not like allies necessarily, but the Nazis are testing their Luftwaffe, they're testing their Air Force, and they want to practice dropping some bombs. And Francisco's like, hey, man, it's cool. Why don't you practice on this little town that doesn't like me very much? Go ahead and practice your bombs on Guernica, right? So this innocent little town that just its biggest mistake was opposing Franco gets bombed by Nazis, even though they're not in direct conflict with the Nazis. They get bombed, a bunch of innocent people are killed, and it's this like massive tragedy perpetrated by the fascists of Spain and the Nazis. And I think Picasso was already working on a wall mural at this time, and after it happened and he heard about it, he totally scrapped the ideas for the mural. They actually have, I think later in some of our chapters, he drew this idea on a napkin, this scene of the bombing and the horrible death of the innocents that occurs at Guernica, and he makes the mural within just a few days of it happening, and it's really meaningful, and it gets moved around and tells a story about this horrible thing that happened. Now, what I'll ask you is, when we were first looking at this and I was just describing what's going on, think about how you connected with it versus think about how you connect with it now that you have that story. And then think about how you would connect with it if you were Spanish. And then think about how you would connect with it if you were French or German. Think about how you would connect with it if you had been alive in the 30s or 40s, right? Or been alive before it, been alive after it. Think about the context of how that is, and think about how all of that context changes your perception of the content. Okay. Context, the time and place, understanding the story. How did it change the content? Just thinking about all that. Okay. So basically, to sum that whole slide up, art means different things to different people in different times and different places, right? Art changes meaning. Now, real quick, recontextualization is altering the context to change meaning. That is possible. So taking something out of its original context, altering the way people look at it, that's called recontextualization, and it's an important part of art. The reason I have corn on here, Chutes and Ladders, I don't know if anybody's heard it. It's just corn playing a bunch of like fairy or like nursery rhymes, but when a creepy metal band plays nursery rhymes, it adds a whole different perception to it, right? So it's recontextualizing the nursery rhymes. It's one of my favorite references to make. I get to talk about corn. But in any case, there's also an artist, Ron English. He makes art about Guernica. He makes all these different versions of Guernica, sometimes with, sorry, I'm going to pop back. Sometimes he makes them with Marvel heroes. Sometimes you make them with McDonald's and Mario, Nintendo characters, right? He totally recontextualizes Star Wars. He has a real famous like Star Wars recontextualization. I think that's in chapter 3. So remember this, remember Guernica when you look at chapter 3. In any case, yeah, recontextualization is part of context. Now, understanding context, though, There's a whole different set of layers like symbolism, iconography, all that we're going to talk about in a second, like going along with context. So to open that up, the linguists are they're rulers of an Alkan tribe. They serve Alkan rulers. Sorry, they're officials that serve the Alkan ruler as translators, spokespersons, and advisors, historians, orators. They're basically wise men of the tribe of Akan, and they carry a specific staff, usually with a symbol of office, some specific symbol atop this staff that they carry. Each one is associated with one or more proverbs from within the tribe, and it's often about the nature of leadership or just the use of power, right? So essentially, these linguists, they carry little objects or little symbols on the top of their staff that tell people within that tribe a specific thing about what that ruler or what that translator spokesperson does, what that advisor does for the tribe. Right. So these specific symbols mean something specific. Again, this has to do with context because you would really only understand the context, if you have context, right? You'd only understand the meaning if you have context. In any case, this connects us to the entire idea of iconography. In order to understand iconography accurately, you do have to have context. But yeah, iconography is its own thing. And so I'm kind of transitioning here to talking about what iconography is they're literally describing images. They're usually features within a piece of art that are recognizable to some, and they help us understand the content, right? Sorry, they help us understand the content. Basically, again, they provide context, but you have to have context to understand the content. Okay, understand all that. So icons are things that have specific meaning that help us understand content. Buddha in this image, he wears a monk's robe, so we know he's a monk. He has elongated ears because it's talked about all the years he lived before he spiritually awakened. The bun on top of his head symbolizes enlightenment. His hand gesture, each hand gesture within Buddhist sculptures has a different meaning, and of course that hand gesture means something different if you're Roman or if you're Mayan or if you're Canadian or American now, right? All these things. Every hand gesture means something different. But in the case here, the gesture is of meditation and balance that he's showing. So that's an icon, something we recognize and we see the meaning of it. He is seated cross-legged in the position of meditation. Right, so we know because of that position that he's meditating, helps us understand what we're supposed to be looking at. The lotus flower under him is a symbol of purity. So the icon telling us purity gives us, again, the idea of content. The halo behind Buddha, the radiant sort of fire explosion behind him, that's spiritual energy, right? So that's, again, content that we understand because of the icon of it. Now, there's all kinds of, every culture, every context has different types of iconography that tell you what's going on. They give you the meaning, right? So Jan van Eyck, the Arnolfini portrait here, this is a famous piece from the Renaissance. It's Northern Renaissance. This is a Dutch painter. So it's not a religious piece per se. It's a piece about this couple that's getting married, but it's a domestic wedding. We see all these really specific symbols. The Northern Renaissance was really big on this. He had the shoes. Both of their shoes are off, so it's domestic, right? They have a dog, which means, again, domestic. This is family. This is home life. There are oranges on the counter behind him, which says he's a merchant, right? He because there's not oranges just hanging out in the Netherlands. He's got some kind of context, at least contacts that are merchants, right? Also, even the candle burning, the chandelier up top, they have enough money to have a candle, but they don't have enough money to have all of them lit. That's a specific story it's telling. Also, Jan van Eyck painted a reflection of himself painting the couple, right, where he signed it, right? All these things are icons. They're symbols that mean specific things. Now, of course, throughout history, we have the obvious icons of religion, which we'll talk about more and more later as we get into art history and like Christian relics and things like that. But at the end of the day, spiritual icons are a really big part of iconography. And the language of icons. We also get into iconoclasm, which happens, I think we talk about that in chapter 3. But yeah, obviously the Christian icon, or I guess any other religion's icon, are really synonymous or really like particular to their context, their time. Now, moving on from icons, which tell us the story, give us the meaning, we also should understand that as we move into the 20th century, not only does it become less about skill and more about genius, but we also get back into, right, artists in the 20th century begin to move back into understanding the ritualism around art, and the work that was more about process and the story that it told than itself, right? Right. So it's not about the finished product, it's about the journey of the product as is how it's being made, right? So that's really an important shift, right? So essentially getting into the process, the way that something was made being just as important to the story or the meaning or the content as the actual thing itself, right? So uh when we look at here at this piece, this is Ai Weiwei's installation, which we'll talk about in a second. It's a bunch of porcelain sunflower seeds. There's a whole documentary that would be awesome if you could go check it out. Look up the sunflower seeds by Ai Weiwei. It's like a 16-minute video about how these porcelain sunflowers were made in the little village where everybody does porcelain work, and how he hired them and paid them, and they made this, and it's representative really of all the overpopulation in China and all this stuff. But the process of making it is really the story here. The way that they made the little porcelain seeds, then they painted them, and then he puts them here, and then you can walk around and take part, and you can pick up sunflower seeds, you can drop them, you can move them. This is all a process oriented, right? So the end product of a pool of sunflower seeds is less important than the story of how they made those sunflower seeds. Now, that's talking about process, but a big part of process is installation, right? Installation art is artwork. We're going to talk a ton about installation, but several different times. But here, I just want to talk about how it's artwork that viewers can walk in, they can explore, they can reflect on a space that has been presented as a piece of art. It's basically a whole space that you get to walk in and take part in, right? And that's at the heart of process art, because you get to do it. You're right. The art is happening as you take place. There's a whole section in our last chapter about process art as this art that you take part in, right? And then installation's a big one of those. Guerrilla art is also a type of process art. In a way, it's art. Guerrilla art's like tagging, any kind of like graffiti, things like that. It's art present. It's part of the world, art that was part of the world with hidden messages for those looking for meaning. So, they talk about homeless people had little images back, like all the way back in the Depression, that told people certain things about where to go if you were homeless and also knew that language. And obviously, I already talked about graffiti artists, and some graffiti artists even ended up being like serious artists, like Basquiat and Shepard Fairey. They get kind of brought into the fold of the big art scene, but they begin as artists who are just putting communication out into the world. And what's interesting about guerrilla art, graffiti art, is that you don't even understand it unless, again, you have that context, right? They're icons that you have to learn about by being a part of that scene, or being attuned to what the graffiti artists in that area are making. So again, all process art. This idea of process comes from the idea of art versus object, right? The making of the art versus the final object. So for many cultures, art and life are inseparable, right? So the occurrence of the art is the thing, it is the art, right? So in the 20th century, many artists began to feel that something important had been lost when art was separated from life and placed in this separate privileged realm. So long ago, when artists started to say art's like fancy people stuff, and it's all about the finished thing, instead of saying, what was the process of this, that they believed, 20th century artists believed something had been lost. So looking beyond the West, looking to other cultures often provided guidance and inspiration. So here we look at the Navajo practice of sand painting as an example of product and process cannot be separated. So the process of painting as a Navajo sand painter, right? These paintings are done as a form of process art, right? So the finished sand painting is going to be a beautiful artwork in itself, but while they're painting it, they're usually saying some sort of prayer or performing some sort of ritual or some sort of remembrance, and that means something specific. The whole process is the artwork. Okay, so Hatali, in the case of the Navajo, is a religious specialist known as a singer. It calls upon spirits to heal and bless someone who is ill. The Navajo Hatali is a shaman. A shaman is any cultural person in any culture that acts as a medium between the human and spirit world. Almost every culture at some point has shamans. They're people who interact between the spirit world and the human world. But in any case, in most cultures where this process art type of like sand painting thing is a thing, the shaman is also the artist, right? They're connecting the real world, the spiritual world, and then they're doing that during an art piece. I don't know. It's all a really cool, beautiful version of process art. It's again connecting the story or the journey of the art piece being made to the final art piece itself, right? It's very cool. Now, process is not always about when the art piece is being made. We have performances, right, that are like masquerade performances. The art piece is made, the mask is made, and then a performance is done where the person puts on the mask or puts on a costume or something, and then the process does continue. Again, the art is being made in the performance, in the process of wearing and performing a ritual of some kind, right? But then it's also the object in the mask, like the process, that ritual is encapsulated in the mask itself, right? As an art object. So process versus, there's the object itself, then there's the way that the object was made, and then there's the ritual that the object fulfills. Okay, so masquerades are big for this. When we look at how 20th century artists and highfalutin, high big time artists use this, we get into performance artwork. So performance art is brought back into the scene in the 20th century, and temporary meaning is embraced. So artwork that again is all about some sort of ritual. Like Joseph Beuys is a really extreme sort of performance artist. He walked around, his face painted gold. He might have had some other materials on there, but he walks around and explains the artwork in a museum to a dead hare, right? And it's a very bizarre and odd performance to watch, but it's all about how it's just this moment of bizarreness, and then that artwork is going to be over, right? It's temporary, it's performance, it's connecting with a deceased thing. I don't know. He also had this famous story of like going to New York, and he wouldn't hang out with any of the art scene people. He hung out in an apartment with a wild coyote, right? That performance in and of itself is a thing. Dali is mostly famous for his performances. We talk later about performance art more specifically, but in general, this all happened. Bringing back performance art is a connection back to those old, like, kind of prior to Western civilization art, museum, capital A art, connecting back to when art was a part of life and a part of ritual. Okay, another version of this is also, art that we get to experience. Talking a little bit about graffiti art, we have like sidewalk chalk is a thing that's in a way a graffiti art and an artwork that we get to take part in because we see it out in the world. But it's also process art because it's a performance watching these guys do these sidewalk chalks. If you ever see them from the side too, they're like super distorted in order to make them appear accurate in perspective when you're looking at it from a certain place. But these artists, the performance of doing the art is just as important as the finished artwork. I remember seeing guys when I visited Mexico once who were painting little spray paint paintings and smearing the spray paint and doing these beautiful sunsets, all with like little tricks with spray paint. That performance is important. Understanding that Jackson Pollock, even the splatter paint guy, his artwork, the finished splatter painting, was kind of a side note to the actual act. Really, you don't understand Jackson Pollock until you see him paint, right? You don't understand it fully until you see him paint. So that's all this connection between ritual and process and object and artist and all this. Another big part of this, just to close out this chapter too, that's important, is artists who work in nature. Andy Goldsworthy, to me, is a performance artist in that he goes out into nature and he uses he creates earthworks, which are just things, they're art objects, they're sculptures where he uses nature, he puts it together with, like in nature, he moves it around and he puts, makes some sort of visual sculptural piece, some object in nature, using nature, but he also understands that it's temporary. Most of his artwork only survives as photographs of it because it's temporary. This, in a way, is performance art because making artwork in nature, using nature, that's going to fade away again back into nature, it's all a big process. We'll talk in later chapters, we talk even more about earthworks, but Andy Goldsworthy is kind of like the man. Actually, there's a whole documentary that's definitely worth watching. It's kind of long, so I won't include it in this class, but if you want to watch Rivers and Tides, it's all about how he alters the earth like makes these sculptures. They're all very non-objective. They're not real looking, but it's just changing the way that we look at the materials in front of us. It's very cool. Kind of fits along with the spiral jetty, which we'll talk about later. Anyway, all that to say, that's the end of chapter 2, kind of getting us all the way up to process art, which is like, or like performance art of the 20th century. We've looked at all different kinds of art in that chapter. What makes that art? What makes art art? Lots of different definitions. I don't know if I really ever landed on one specific thing, but I gave you some criteria that we use to define art. So just take that for what it is, those different criteria that we looked at, and just kind of remember those as we dig further into chapter 3 is going to be themes, and then from there we get into elements, principles, medium, art history, all that stuff. Just kind of remember all this, what makes art art, as we're looking at that. Okay, in any case, I think that's enough. I will let you go now. I appreciate you. Let me know if you have any questions online.